Good evening and welcome to the 2021 ABA Silver Gavel Awards virtual presentation program. As president of the American Bar Association, I am honored to present these prestigious awards, which recognize outstanding efforts in media and the arts to foster public understanding of law. This year marks the 64th annual presentation of the Gavel Awards. They are among the ABA's most important and enduring annual traditions. The awards were first presented in 1958 under the visionary leadership of ABA President Charles Ryan, who also established National Law Day. Over the years, our extraordinary awardees have addressed many matters of law and justice through works that continue to resonate with the American public. They include, from the Silver Gavel's first year, Sidney Lumet's classic jury room drama, 12 Angry Men, starring Henry Fonda as juror number 8. From 1960, the CBS drama Perry Mason, when lead actor Raymond Burr came to the ABA annual meeting in St. Louis to accept the award. From 2012, the Central Park Five by documentarian Ken Berens. From 2015, season 1 of the audio program Serial. From 2017, the best-selling book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And last year, the film Just Mercy, based on Brian Stevenson's extraordinary book. Please visit ambar.org/gavel to learn more about these honorees and many more. This year, the ABA is awarding 6 Silver Gavels and 6 honorable mentions in the categories of books, documentaries, newspapers, radio, and multimedia. Our outstanding chair of the Standing Committee on Gavel Awards, Sharon Stern Gerstman, will join me in introducing the award recipients and highlighting their exceptional work.
Thank you, Trish. I am honored to serve as the chair of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Gavel Awards. The Gavel Awards are extremely selective. This year's honorees, 6 Silver Gavel Awards and 6 Honorable Mention Awards, were selected from among many wonderful entries and emerged as standouts across a months-long screening and review process of over 100 applicants. Our program this evening will begin with the award presentations. First, honorable mentions, followed by the Silver Gavels. We'll hear about each awardee and hear from some of the key creators behind the outstanding works. Then we will hear from this evening's featured speaker, David McCraw, Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times. By the time we conclude, we hope you will have gotten a flavor of the extraordinary contributions that the awardees make toward fostering public understanding of the law. Without further ado, let's get started. I am pleased to present the following 2021 ABA Gavel Award Honorable Mention Awards. First, in the category of books, Supreme Inequality, Penguin Press, Adam Cohn, author. For documentaries, Belly of the Beast, Idlewild Films, Erica Cohn, director-producer, Angela Tucker, Kristen Marquez, and Nicola Docta, producers, and The Vote, American Experience, a 42nd Parallel Films production for American Experience, Michelle Ferrari, writer, director, producer, Connie Honeycutt, producer, Nancy Novak and Ilya Chaikin, editors, Mark Samuels and Susan Bellows, executive producers. For magazines, the 1857 Project, Gateway Journalism Review with support from the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, William Freivogel, publisher, Steve Edwards, illustrator, Amelia Blakely and Kayla Chamness, student reporters. For newspapers, Mayan Burrell Walks Free, Associated Press, Robin McDowell and Margie Mason, reporters, Sasha Aslanian, producer. John Minchillo, photographer. For radio, Louder Than a Riot, NPR. Rodney Carmichael and Sydney Madden, hosts reporters. Rachel Neal, senior supervising producer. Michael May, Matt Ozig, Dustin DeSoto, Adina Lancianese, and Sam Leeds, producers. Chiquita Pascal and Chenjurai Kuminaika, editors. Steve Nelson, senior programming director. Lauren Anke, senior music director. To read committee commentaries and interviews with the honorable mention awardees, please see the accompanying program booklet at ambar.org/Gavel Awards.
Thank you, Sharon. And now let's move on to the 6 Silver Gavel Award recipients. The 2021 Silver Gavel Award for books goes to Marriage Equality, From Outlaws to In-Laws, Yale University Press, William Eskridge and Christopher Riano, authors.
In Marriage Equality, From Outlaws to In-Laws, authors William Eskridge and Christopher Riano sought to tell the story of what might be the most significant transformation of law in our times, those concerning same-sex marriage. They offer a panoramic history of America's marriage equality debate. They explore deeply religious and political debates and the administrative and constitutional features of this dramatic history. While giving a full account of the legal and political issues, the authors never lose sight of the personal stories of the people involved, or of the central place the right to marry holds in a person's ability to enjoy the dignity of full citizenship. This was not a book to celebrate victory, but a thoughtful history of how the nation wrestled with an important question of moral and legal equality, and how laws are made and can change over time. Accepting the award is author William Eskridge, and he is joined by co-author Christopher Riano. Please join me in hearing more about marriage equality.
The project had its genesis in the 1980s and the 1990s, when I first, as a law professor at Georgetown University, became involved in equality for LGBTQ people. And I was actually an attorney, the attorney, for the first marriage equality case after the 1970s that was filed in Washington, D.C., and lasted from 1991 to 1995. So I started writing about the issue, and the issue very much engaged me because so many of my friends and my own family were involved in long-term committed relationships, many of them raising children within those relationships. And I felt very strongly in the 1990s and the early part of the millennium that this was an easy case to extend equality rights. Chris and I, who've both been working on LGBTQ equality issues, felt that we were well positioned to write what we think would be the classic or definitive book on the marriage equality movement as part of a larger history of America and a larger history of social movements. And it took us 4 or 5 years to actually research and write it.
We felt really strongly that we wanted to be able to tell a lot of the stories that had not necessarily been told before. And I think that's one of the voices that people really have seen that resonate with folks, especially when it comes to telling the tale of course, the LGBTQ rights movement, but the intersectionality that occurs when it comes to social justice and racial justice, and how there were so many different people involved in the 50-year history. And I know that those are all stories that we really were excited to tell.
People of color, straight as well as gay, women, transgender persons, were all marginalized in existing accounts of the marriage equality movement. And our view, based upon experience and interviews, was that these Americans were actually critical to the success of the movement. Like, no book had even mentioned that the first federal lawsuit for marriage equality was filed by an African-American female couple. Not a single book had mentioned that the first Defense of Marriage Act lawsuit was filed by a transgender person and represented by transgender lawyers. Not a single book had even mentioned, much less emphasized, the critical role that Latinx Americans played in the victories of marriage equality in California. And so our book is the first effort to present the actual story of the Rainbow Coalition that generated marriage equality's successes.
It's a story of families. It's a story of change in the Constitution, and it's a story about changes in religion, but it's a collection of stories, and we're telling people's accounts. And we felt really strongly that that was a really important part of putting this together. And I think at the end of the day, that's an incredible resource, was the access that people gave us, whether it was from the pro-marriage equality side or those who were against marriage equality. I think one of the things that Bill and I were very, very pleased to be able to do was to tell the various different parts and the real stories that went into that 50-year history. And that is a resource that I really have to say, I think we're both very proud to have had access to.
But it's really a story about how America itself changed. And a key variable in our account is that marriage equality came really inevitably, in large part because of the changing status, role, and economic power of women in America. That women in America between 1967 and 2017 entered the workplace and the public sphere in unprecedented numbers and force. Women in America changed the face of American families through their own relationship and childbearing decisions. Women in America opened the door to critique of gender stereotyping and homophobia. So it's a story about how America has changed, how the American family has changed, and how American family law has changed, not just expanding the right to marry to sexual and gender minorities, but evolving the whole concept of family and child raising away from a purely biological model.
I think one thing that was very important for both of us as people who teach law is that we showed how social justice and social change and legal change is possible. And it's not just through a court case. It's not necessarily just through passing legislation. And it's not necessarily through executive action. It's not necessarily at the federal level, the state level, or the local level. It's all of those.
Winning the Silver Gavel Award is a great honor bestowed by the ABA, a great personal honor for both of us. But we also think this is an honor that the ABA is giving to the thousands of same-sex couples and their allies and their children and their families who, from the 1970s on through the present, have been a testament to the concept that love makes a family and not just biological procreation. So the award is for them.
The 2021 Silver Gavel Award for documentaries goes to Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America, Steeplechase Films, and the Cooperstown Graduate Program. Emily Fiel, Catherine Clenard, and Stephen Bennett, producers. Gretchen Sorin and Rick Burns, writers and directors. Emir Lewis, editor, producer.
If you caught Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America on PBS during the past year, you'll remember how compelling, creative, and effective it is as a documentary, ostensibly about driving, but in truth, about segregationist laws, civil rights, and freedom. It explores the history of African Americans on the road, from the advent of the automobile through the 1960s to the present and the more contemporary origins of the phrase driving while black. The documentary explores the deep background of that phrase, which is rooted in the realities that have been an indelible part of the African American experience for hundreds of years. told in large part through the stories of the men, women, and children who lived through it. With us this evening are the writers, directors, and producers of Driving While Black from Steeplechase Films and the Cooperstown Graduate Program. Gretchen Sorin is accepting the award on behalf of the group. Welcome.
Mobility is essential to freedom.
It's difficult to overstate the importance of the road and the car in American life.
What it means to be American is to take to the road.
To control your own destiny.
Discovery, freedom.
Could I see some ID, please?
The notion of driving while black reminds us that that's not available to all Americans.
Living while black, sleeping while black, eating while black, moving while black. That goes all the way back to day one.
The power to choose, to be able to move freely in space. We live in a country where it's never been everybody's right.
If you're an African American and you can afford a car, it provides a powerful alternative.
What the automobile allows is personal freedom.
I think the automobile allows us to understand the way that African Americans have moved forward in this country and the way that African Americans have been pushed back.
For African Americans, trips across country are not adventures. They can often be trials.
With a car full of your family whom you love, and your wife is saying, we got to stop for the night. And what do you do?
So that's where the Green Book was indispensable, to give you some way to find a place where you could get some rest, get something to eat without being violated.
Once they were inside this building, nobody was going to worry them.
People are not going to let themselves be paved over. They will insist that their voices are heard.
This officer is unlocking my car.
There are still so many dangers. African Americans are feeling a similar fear as their grandparents felt.
That's how y'all treat black people, huh?
We have to engage history with a kind of brutal honesty.
And until we get to a place in which we actually are trying to live up to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for every human being who is in our society, then we're not there yet.
I started thinking about this project when a colleague of mine handed me a copy of the Negro Motorist Green Book about 20 years ago, long before the movie Green Book, long before anybody was even thinking about it. And I was really curious about it because I didn't know anything about it. And I realized after doing some research that it was a much bigger story, that it really wasn't just about this little guide that African Americans used to travel, that it was a story about the automobile, that it was a story about travel and mobility, and that it was a story about segregation.
When Gretchen Sorin came to me and showed me these photographs, this kind of record of, essentially 100 years of automobility, it was revelatory. And I was honored that she asked my colleagues and me to be kind of part of the project with her. It was very quickly apparent just what a incredibly important and in many ways untold story about a crucial aspect of the American experience.
And one of the things that was so powerful in the film is the voices of the people that we talked to all over the country who told their stories of their experiences of travel, going out on the road, and experiencing what it meant to live in a society that was segregated. And those stories are so incredibly moving. I want people to understand the meaning of systemic racism. And I would like them to say enough is enough, and we need to stop killing Black people in this country, having law enforcement kill Black people. I think that this is an incredibly prescient film because it couldn't have come out at a more appropriate time. And I just hope it moves enough people so that they want to work within their own communities to bring about police reform.
Our hope, I think, as a group is that this subject and a film on it can really take people in and take them by the hand. It's not meant to be remonstrative. It's meant to be demonstrative. Here's what it is. This is our world. Do we accept it? Do we shrug our shoulders? Or do we say, maybe there's a better way?
Rick said, a car on the highway, what's more American than that? And I can almost guarantee that every Black person watching this will be thinking, racism? What is more American than that? Racism.
I feel extraordinarily honored and gratified to be recognized by the premier institution that has to do with law in America, a country that prides itself on being a nation of laws. It means everything to me.
It's perhaps less covert. The way that we talk about the law in this film is not as explicit, perhaps, as saying, okay, this is about the law. But I was so excited to see that the American Bar Association knew that that's what this story was about.
In accepting an award like this, one wants to say, wow, one's accepting it on behalf of a really large collective of people for whom the truth matters, the principles matter, and who feel that this story is central. That goes to include funders, the National Endowment for the Humanities, PBS, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, who have been stalwart supporters, the Sloan Foundation. It's been really striking to see how from the very beginning, a really amazing cohort of funders and supporters saw how important Gretchen's work was, and how much it needed to be supported and brought out to a television audience and film audience.
The 2021 Silver Gavel Award for magazines goes to Fear, Illness, and Death in ICE Detention, Type Investigations, Seth Wessler, Reporting Fellow.
Fear, Illness, and Death in ICE Detention tells the story of the early pandemic as experienced in an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement facility, the Irwin County Detention Center in South Georgia. Seth Wessler, the reporter with Type Investigations, spoke directly and repeatedly with people in the facility, ICE administrators and employees, detainees as they grappled with how to manage amid extraordinarily challenging conditions. He chronicled how life in the facility of 700 people remained largely unchanged as the country shut down, masked, and social distanced, and the implications of the crisis for those detainees and employees. He told the story of how detainees across the country in ICE facilities and jails fought for COVID-safe protocols and PPE, staging strikes and in at least 18 jurisdictions, winning release in federal courts. Please join me in congratulating Seth Wessler for Fear, Illness, and Death in ICE Detention and welcoming him this evening.
In March 2020, all of us in our own ways were trying to figure out what the world was about to look like as the pandemic spread, as we realized that the COVID-19 was going to turn the world upside down. And as a reporter, I began to call sources of mine from previous reporting who were inside of detention centers, immigration detention centers around the country. In one of those detention centers, the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia, I began to call people I knew from previous reporting to find out what was happening inside of that immigration detention center. I found myself on these video calls sort of constantly, sometimes many hours in a day, and sometimes deep into the night, to track what was happening inside of this facility where people were locked up in very close quarters. Those interviews became the basis for this story that I published with Type Investigations and the New York Times Magazine about life inside of an immigration detention center during the pandemic, and also about a group of people organizing in protest to demand protections and to demand their release as this pandemic spread into the facility where they were held. People can be released from detention. They can be released on their own recognizance. They can be released with conditions. And in a period of a spreading pandemic where people are held in these really tight conditions, where there are very few protections from the virus, it made sense to everyone inside and to their attorneys that people would be released, would be allowed to wait for their court hearings at home with their families. These people were losing. ICE was refusing to release people, and the courts were, in many cases, refusing to impose orders. I think that this story is really about a group of people held inside of an immigration detention center who are organizing in protest to demand that they be protected. ICE detention gets abstracted in many cases. It's talked about as a political issue. People have opinions about it, but very rarely are people who are currently inside of detention centers, the people speaking about what it's like to be inside, they became my central sources to understand what was happening inside. The video, though, is not free. It costs 25 cents a minute for me on the outside to have a conversation with somebody on the inside. And, for many people, those kinds of really expensive calls are prohibitive. For many people's families, the people who I was talking to and whose protest I reported on for the New York Times Magazine, they continued to organize after our story published, and I continued to have these video calls, continued to stay in touch with people inside of that facility. And organizers and activists on the outside really began to connect with people on the inside to try to bolster the organizing that they had started to demand protections and release. And then in September of last year, a nurse who worked in the facility filed a whistleblower complaint with the federal government that, on the one hand, fully corroborated the kinds of complaints that detained people were making about the lack of protections as the pandemic spread, but also alleged that a doctor had been performing unnecessary gynecological procedures on women who were held in the Irwin County Detention Center. And that news spread like wildfire all over the press in the United States. And just last month in May, the Biden administration actually ordered ICE to sever its contract with LaSalle Corrections to stop holding immigrant detainees inside of the Irwin Detention Center. So that the facility is supposed to, in the near future, the contract should end, and people will no longer be held in that particular Immigration and Customs Enforcement Detention Center. Winning this award is really an incredible honor, and it also, I think, is a recognition of those people's work, ongoing work, to try to raise their own voices, to organize themselves inside of a place that makes that very, very difficult to do.
The Silver Gavel Award for Multimedia goes to American Injustice, Reuters.
American Injustice is a web series produced by Reuters that examines the systemic failures of U.S. policing. Looking at stories from across the country, Reuters reporters found institutional failings of U.S. law enforcement and criminal and civil justice in 4 distinct areas: police unions, local jails, judges, and the legal concept of qualified immunity. Joining us this evening are members of the Reuters staff from around the world, with Peter Eisler accepting the Silver Gavel.
The qualified immunity investigation can be traced back to 2017 and a case that came to the Supreme Court. And in that case, it was a man who was shot in the back, and he sued the police officer, but his lawsuit failed because the officer was granted qualified immunity. And in that case, what made it remarkable was that Sonia Sotomayor wrote a kind of a blistering dissent. She said that it was reflective of this kind of disturbing trend at the court to protect police officers, allowing police to shoot first and think later. And it was giving the public this idea that police will be protected regardless. So we wanted to test this. How can we determine how qualified immunity is working on the ground in courts.
I think with judges, which was another aspect of this project, it began when we started investigating an Illinois judge who had been using cocaine and other drugs on the bench for over a decade. And it began with a simple question: how many judges are disciplined in America? And the answer was, by everyone, we don't know. So there's nothing more magnetic to a journalist than the answer, I don't know. And that's when we began the most comprehensive analysis of judicial discipline across America.
So for our piece, which was on mortality in local jails, so we were trying to find out, how did the death rate in this particular jail compare to other jails around it? It was a relatively innocuous question that was just really to provide some context. And we found out that the federal government collected mortality data from jails. So we went to the Justice Department and we asked for the data, and they said, no, you can't have it. And I guess if there's another question that motivates reporters, it's you can't have it. So we were frustrated. We realized at that point that there was no way to get any sort of data on inmate deaths in jails across the country. There was no way to identify jails that were especially deadly, that had really outsized mortality rates, or to understand how people were dying in those jails. For example, if a jail had a big problem with suicide or something, there was no way for anyone to know. We sort of dug a little deeper and found out, in fact, that yes, this data is collected from all the jails, and no, under this obscure statutory restriction, it's not made available. Not only isn't it available to the public or to journalists, but it's not available to policymakers or members of Congress. It's not even available to lawyers at the Justice Department who are charged with identifying bad jails and going after them. So we decided that we were going to go out and create it ourselves. And we worked up a methodology where we would gather data from about 500 of the largest jails in the country and the 10 biggest jails in every state. And then we spent, I think, the better part of 18 months filing records requests with these hundreds of jails under state open records laws and putting together the database that was sort of the spine of the project.
I think overall, the topic of racial injustice is something that we as a team have really been covering for years. There was a story I did in 2017 about police union contracts, and we decided to revisit it and see if anything had changed with a few years of activism, and it hadn't really.
We had to read thousands of cases just to identify which lawsuits involved qualified immunity. And once we had those down, we then had to pour through every exhibit.
And some of the jails that we were going to were very small. They'd never gotten a records request before. They had no sense that they needed to provide us with the data we were asking for in many cases. And of course, you're dealing with open records laws in 50 different states, and some states have stronger laws than others.
When it came to judges, we had incredible hurdles in the sense that every state disciplines a judge in a different way with a different system. Thousands and thousands of records were sealed or deemed confidential. We found that equally thousands of judges were being secretly disciplined and then allowed to retire without any formal disciplinary mark whatsoever. So my colleague, John Schiffman, and I, he started state by state building spreadsheets and data sets of every judge who had been accused of an impropriety or a violation. We found 3,600 plus judges who had been secretly disciplined. We've put up a database for the public to be able to search judges in their own jurisdictions or states to be able to see what's going on.
I think our story also started with data collection. We looked at police union contracts in more than 100 cities, and collecting them took a lot of time, reading through them took a lot of time. And then we realized ultimately that it wasn't just the contracts, it was also state labor laws. So we went back and read state labor laws across the country.
Connecting with people who have, suffered these injustices, and then to be able to convince them to tell their stories through us. That was another huge challenge, but I think it was also successful in all of these projects that we were able to tell, some complicated stories through the eyes of real people.
I think the most important part, at least for me and for John, was that we gave voices to victims who had been trying to be heard for a long time.
And for us reporting on police union contracts, I think it was a lot about awareness and explaining the nuances and the different layers of protection. We hope that cities going forward have an inkling of kind of all the barriers that they'll have to overcome if they want to really change the union contract.
So this is just an incredible honor right here. I think we're all so proud and so grateful to have our work recognized with this award. It says a lot because it comes from an organization of legal professionals, and all of the work obviously that we've been doing revolves around legal policy, public policy, and the law. It's really nice to have the people who you are oftentimes calling on for their expertise, relying on as sources to turn back and say, hey, you did a really terrific job with this and you made a difference. And I think that's what this is all about. And I just it's something for which I think we're all really, really thankful.
The Silver Gavel Award for newspapers goes to Targeted, Tampa Bay Times, Kathleen McGrory and Adam Playford, investigations editors, Neil Betty, investigative reporter, Douglas Clifford, staff photojournalist.
In Targeted, the Tampa Bay Times explores what the Pasco County, Florida Sheriff describes as the implementation of intelligence-led policing, an attempt to stop crime before it happens. When Sheriff Chris Noco took office in 2011, it was a bold plan, and it revolved around a series of continuous monitoring and harassment. Targets were identified using unspecified intelligence data and algorithms, and the system ensnared the target's children, parents, siblings, employers, anyone in the target's orbit. Many of the targets were children. Other major cities that used intelligence-led policing have stopped, recognizing that the practice raises big questions. In Pasco County, Florida, the program expanded. Please join me in welcoming reporter Kathleen McGrory, who is accepting the Gavel Award.
We first learned about this police intelligence program by reading a federal lawsuit that had been filed against the Pasco County Sheriff. The lawsuit was hundreds of pages and about a wide variety of things, but there was one allegation in that suit that really stood out to us. And it came from a former deputy who alleged that he had been ordered to harass Pasco County residents. So upon reading that, my reporting partner, Neil, and I really wanted to learn more about this program. We started off by making some public records requests and by asking for an interview with the sheriff. The sheriff wouldn't grant us the interview, and the records that we wanted turned out to be pretty hard to come by. So we just decided to hit the road, essentially, and we started knocking on doors of residents who had been targeted and asking them what the experience had been like. And in the course of interviewing all of these people, we started hearing the same thing over and over again. And that really encouraged us to continue digging. What we found was that the sheriff's office was using a rather crude algorithm to make lists of citizens that the agency believed would be likely to break the law in the future, and then essentially sending deputies to those people's homes over and over again. And in speaking to people who had been targeted and pulling public records, we learned that those interactions could look like deputies surrounding your home in the middle of the night, waking up everybody by knocking on the doors rather loudly, shining flashlights into your windows. In some instances, the deputies would show up and write code enforcement citations for things like your grass being too long or there being trash in the yard. We spoke to one deputy who was a leader in this program, and he said that the orders from his supervisor had been to make these people's lives miserable until they either sued the department or moved out of the county. We also took a look at a related program that essentially used data from the school district. So looked at students' grades, looked at some other information too, for example, whether they had been the subject of multiple custody disputes, whether or not they had been abused. and crunched all of that information to make a list of students that the department thought might one day become future criminals. And that was something that we were able to expose to the public as well. A lot of the public records that we sought to get, we really had to fight for. Some of them we weren't able to get, we were denied. The sheriff's office said that they weren't in fact public records at all because they were dealing with police intelligence. But really digging this out, unearthing this required some of the most difficult reporting that I've ever had to do. Shortly after we published the initial stories, members of the community, parents, teachers, folks who had been targeted, civil rights groups came together and started demanding more accountability and more transparency from the sheriff's office. We saw a number of the people who had been targeted joined forces with a national public interest law firm to file a federal lawsuit against the sheriff's office. And we also saw a U.S. congressman condemn a lot of these practices since a piece of this program involved using student data, education records, and using that information to determine which citizens were most likely to become criminals in the future. This congressman asked the U.S. Department of Education to investigate, and the DOE did in fact launch an investigation. And after that happened, we saw the local school districts pretty dramatically curtail what information is available to the sheriff's office and when. Winning the Silver Gavel is just a tremendous honor, and we are really appreciative of the recognition from the American Bar Association. On behalf of my reporting partner, Neil Betty, and myself, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Tampa Bay Times, all of the reporters and editors and designers who work tirelessly to make sure that there's a daily newspaper, and also to the leadership of the Tampa Bay Times for supporting our efforts in reporting this project. And we'd also really like to thank the families that shared their stories with us. We appreciate their courage in helping us to shine a light on these practices.
The 2021 Silver Gavel Award for Radio goes to Buried Truths, Season 3, Ahmaud Arbery, WABE, Jayanne Berry and John Haas, executive producers, David Barasoain, senior producer, Richard Halix and Hank Klibanoff, writers.
We can't change our history, but we can let it guide us to understanding. That's the idea behind the Buried Truths podcast. The program, now in its third season, is produced by WABE, the NPR station in Atlanta, and investigates still relevant stories of injustice, resilience, and racism in the American South. Season 1 focused on Isaiah Nixon, voter suppression, and new beginnings. Season 2 told the story of A.C. Hall, a Black teenager mistakenly identified as stealing a gun in Macon, Georgia in 1962. Season 3, this year's Gavel Award-winning radio program, concerns the very recent high-profile story of Ahmaud Arbery. Many of the show's topics emerge from cases that students study in writer Hank Klibanoff's Civil Rights Cold Cases class at Emory University. Accepting the Gavel Award and joining us now to talk about Buried Truths, Season 3, are the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist, and professor Hank Klibanoff, and producers with WABE, Jayanne Berry and David Barasoain.
Well, what exactly did citizen Greg McMichael see? He saw Ahmaud Arbery running down the road. McMichael told the police that Ahmaud looked like the same man who was videotaped walking around inside the house under construction. So he and Travis grabbed their guns and went after him. So now follow this, because it boils down to this. There was no felony. So no felony, no probable cause to chase Ahmaud. And no probable cause to chase Ahmaud, then there's no defending this as a citizen's arrest, at least not legitimately. And absent that defense, the McMichaels, well, they become lawless vigilantes with nothing on their side but guns and a pickup truck.
We have this saying that when we understand who we were, we can understand who we are. Months after Ahmaud Arbery is actually killed, it hits the news cycle, but it was so clearly a moment in which the lines were blurred of this concept of who we were versus who we are. And I remember Hank said, you know, guys, I really think we need to do an episode on Ahmaud Arbery, which we quickly saw warranted much more than an episode and became a season. Working on a case that was still an active case had a very different feel to it than working on cases that we had distance from and where we were diving into the context, but it was all with a lens looking back. And so it was, I think for us, it heightened our approach in terms of really understanding all of the different ways in which the case could develop.
You know, if the host and the writers and the guests on the show unfold the story clearly, and if they describe the characters distinctly, and if they explain the complications of the law patiently, and if they do it accessibly, then the audience can have this seamless, undistracted, compelling experience. And that is our goal. And we've gotten better at it, I have to say, over the seasons of Buried Truths, at being very clear. And we want our audience to have such a clear understanding of the law in this case that they in turn can explain it to others. And that became our goal on things, such as the citizen arrest law and whether that really was appropriately applied in this case.
I'd like to think that once the video was released and the story was out there in the world, in the national and international press, everybody was, a lot of people were shocked. A lot of people were horrified. But as far as the impact of the podcast goes, I am happy to report that this citizen's arrest law that had been hanging around in Georgia since 1863, a very nebulous law that, gave citizens limited powers to detain someone if they had witnessed a felony, and then they could detain them. House Bill 479, it was just signed in May of 2021, and it takes away the citizen's arrest law from state law. It does allow security officers and private investigators, off-duty officers, to detain someone. But other than that, this citizen's arrest provision has now been struck from state law. And so we're glad to say that maybe as a whole in the world of journalism and Buried Truths as a part of that, we help to foster that change.
I've known of the Civil Gavel Award for many years. I had never been part of an entry into it. It's interesting, and this may or may not be known by many of the people who are watching this, but many news organizations will choose not to submit their staff's work to contests hosted by trade associations and advocacy groups. I remember once I won an award covering agricultural issues in the Midwest, and I wasn't allowed to take it because it was sponsored by Pioneer Seed Company. And then ultimately Pioneer said, well, that's no good if journalists can't accept it. So they gave it to the University of Illinois Department of Communications, and they gave it every year, and it became relatively prestigious award for covering agricultural issues. But many of these contests in the past by trade associations have track records of endorsing only the work that furthers their own group's positions. But the ABA, through all the years that I've been watching it, going back to when I was at the Boston Globe and at the Philadelphia Inquirer, that they've shown through their selections for this annual Silver Gavel Award over the past 6 decades that its interest is in furthering the public understanding of the law and in maintaining the integrity of the award. And so, it's unassailable. When you win that award, that is probably the highest stamp of approval from a legal organization, a law-based organization, a law-focused organization that there is, and it validates the high standards and the principles that guide our work and buried truths. So, thank you.
Sharon, thank you for your help in presenting the 2021 Silver Gavel Awards. Let me add my personal congratulations to the honorees and my appreciation for all that they have done to advance public understanding of the law. I also want to thank the 18 members of the Standing Committee on Gavel Awards and the 50 members of its screening committee for their dedication in judging entries. I'm now delighted to introduce our featured speaker, David McCraw, and especially want to thank Standing Committee on Gavel Awards member Alamin Sumar for his role in arranging Mr. McCraw's participation. David McCraw is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times. He is the author of Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. At the Times, Mr. McCraw is the principal legal advisor on almost all of the paper's stories. He has been the lead litigation attorney on freedom of information lawsuits brought by the Times. He is also the Times crisis response manager when reporters are kidnapped or detained overseas. He has worked closely on initiatives designed to protect the safety of journalists. Please join me in welcoming David McCraw.
Good evening. On the night of Wednesday, March 3rd, I was sitting at home doing what I, like all of you, have done this past year, staring into a laptop, living my life through my email inbox. I'm a newsroom lawyer for the New York Times, so as evening turned to night, my inbox was filling, as it almost always does, with messages from journalists at the Times. There was an email from a photo editor with the intriguing subject line, "Urgent, final funeral home question." Someone in the arts section was sending a message labeled "Serbian film controversy." Then there was the email from an editor in politics asking me to review a difficult, messy story. He didn't sugarcoat it at all. The subject line of his email read, "Not exactly a coveted assignment." Thankfully, there was a Nick Kristof column in my inbox with advice that is pretty much the story of every lawyer's life: how to reach people who are wrong. But in the midst of that onslaught of incoming emails, there was one I didn't recognize. It looked like spam. It came from the bizarro address US law enforcement at google.com. And it had two attachments. Yeah. I know the first lesson of information security. Do not click on the links in a spam email, but I couldn't help myself. I clicked. What popped up on my screen was astonishing. There were two orders from a federal court in Washington. They ordered Google to turn over to federal prosecutors the email logs of 4 Times reporters who had covered the connections between the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian operatives. The order permitted Google to tell one person in the whole world about the otherwise secret order. That person was me, which is why US law enforcement at google.com was writing to me, so I could fight the order if I wanted to. And, well, to be clear about it, I really wanted to. For the next 3 months, assisted by our outside counsel, we secretly fought back to get the order withdrawn. But until June 4th, while all of that was going on, I was under a gag order imposed by the federal court. Good news came on June 4th. That was the day the order was withdrawn by the government. The email records of our reporters would not be turned over. I was no longer gagged. The news came appropriately enough as we were marking the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court's revolutionary decision in the Pentagon Papers case. But as good as it felt to prevail and protect our reporters' confidential information, the whole event served as an important reminder. The fight for press freedom, the fight to resist government interference with our rights as journalists and authors and documentary filmmakers is not over. It's easy for people to forget that in our times. Think about the issues that now dominate the public debate over the state of public communication in this country. Should Facebook ban Donald Trump? What can we do about trolling and doxing, revenge porn, and hate speech on social media? Should Twitter be required to give equal play to conservatives? Is runaway campaign spending killing democracy? Those are important issues. Those are issues we should all care about. And the use of social media to intimidate and silence journalists is a serious, toxic, and vicious assault on the pursuit of truth. But we can't forget the core concern of the First Amendment, keeping the press free from government meddling. It was not that the authors of the First Amendment thought that bad people would end up in power, although, well, they do sometimes. It was that the authors knew that the combination of human nature and the possession of power could cause leaders to act in ways that needed to be checked by a free and vigilant press. We may no longer talk about overt censorship, but think of the ways the government still controls what gets reported. They do so in ways that are often invisible to much of the public, whether that is by prosecuting government whistleblowers who tell their stories to reporters, or by keeping secret critical information that the public has a right to know, or forcing journalists to reveal sources, or arresting and detaining journalists at protests, or closing court proceedings, or corralling reporters and photographers to make sure they are far away from the place where news is actually happening. Now, not as obvious as censorship, but it has the same effect. It keeps the public from knowing what the public needs to know. If you look at the outstanding work that is being honored here tonight, you know why governments at all levels, state, local, federal, would want to use whatever power they could find to silence the voice of these honorees and the voices of their colleagues, to hide the abuse and misuse of government power, to draw attention away from the subversion of democracy and justice. The award winners tonight use their words, their pictures, their videos, and old-fashioned on-the-ground reporting to tell the world about how lawmakers and courts persecuted gay Americans and how police use traffic laws as a fire hose of discrimination against Black motorists. They shed much needed light on what was really going on inside those ICE detention centers, and they reported how an arrest-hungry Florida sheriff turned data into oppression, and how our system of justice makes it nearly impossible to hold bad cops accountable. And they revealed how the authorities who should have been finding and prosecuting the killers of Ahmaud Arbery spent their time instead figuring out how to look the other way and hope that nobody noticed. Of course, people in power, people in elected offices, people wearing badges don't want those stories told. Why would they? It's so much easier for them to do their jobs when no one is looking, when the information that is needed to tell those stories is locked away and buried. Too many people in government want a democracy of sleep, where citizens are never awakened to unpleasant and inconvenient truths about the things that are being done by their government in their name. I want to thank all the award winners and all their colleagues who every day have decided that is not the American reality we choose to live in, who every day have decided that the truth can make America a better place, a fairer place, and a more just country. And we need to keep fighting to make sure that we have the press freedom that allows that important work to continue. If you sit where I sit, you know something else. You know that what we do in this country about press freedom has global consequences. The world follows our lead. As I dealt with a gag order and government investigation here, I was repeatedly reminded of the struggles that journalists face around the world. A Zimbabwean journalist who worked with New York Times reporters was jailed for 3 weeks falsely accused of getting our reporters fake credentials to work in the country. India enacted a new law that empowered the government to order news websites like ours to take down stories that harmed social unity. Last month, 500 police officers raided a Hong Kong newspaper and charged editors and executives with violating the national security law. And in Nicaragua, authorities refused to let a Times reporter enter the country to cover the abuses of power that were taking place in the lead up to the November election. Leaders around the world have spent 4 years watching an American administration denounce journalists as the enemy of the people, purveyors of fake news, disgusting people. Why, if that is the view of the press in the United States, home of the First Amendment, and it's coming from the Oval Office, should they show any restraint in their countries? Why should they tolerate journalists who want to use the truth to liberate their fellow citizens? None of this is to say that we don't enjoy an amazing amount of press freedom in this country. We do. But the battle to preserve it and expand it is never really over. And this is a particularly dangerous time because the level of skepticism about the press has never been higher. In 2020, Gallup reported that 60% of respondents had little or no trust in the news media. In 2018, an Ipsos poll showed that 26% of Americans believe that the president should have the power to shut down news organizations that misbehave. That one's worth repeating. 1 in 4 Americans believe that the president should have the power to shut down news organizations that misbehave, whatever that means. Whatever else we know about the writing of the First Amendment, we're pretty sure that is not what the authors had in mind. And here's the thing. If people don't give a damn about the press, it's not long before they don't give a damn about press freedom. So what can we do? It's never going to be easy. But for you who are award winners and your colleagues in journalism, the task is clear. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep telling the stories that those in powers don't want you to tell. Pursue the truth wherever it takes you. Telling stories that are true and fair and meaningful in real people's lives is the best way we have to win back a doubting public. As for the rest of us, we need to speak up. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, whether you are a Bernie bro or a Trumper, whether you are a faithful follower of Fox News or you have a crush on Rachel Maddow, you need to remind your fellow citizens that a free press matters, that whatever the failings of the press are on any given day, we need an independent press to make our democracy work. Think about this. In 2010, Congress passed the Speech Act to protect American publishers and writers against foreign libel suits that threatened to silence their voices. It was the most important libel legislation ever passed by Congress. It passed unanimously in the House. Every Democrat, every Republican. It passed unanimously in the Senate. Every Democrat, every Republican. That was just 11 years ago. I know it seems like a lifetime ago, but little more than a decade away from us where we stand today. We owe it to ourselves to find our way back to that American consensus. We need to remind people that a belief in press freedom is not a liberal value or a conservative value. It is an American value. There needs to be a national conversation about the singular importance of press freedom. Take it from someone who was gagged by his government. There is a reason people in authority issue gag orders. There is a reason why they try to drown out the voices of truth. They know that speech is powerful. You know that too. So for those of us who care about the future of press freedom, who understand how important it is to protect free expression, now is a really, really good time to remember the essential message, the core meaning of the First Amendment. Don't shut up.
Mr. McCraw, thank you for your engaging and inspiring remarks. And thank you all for joining us for this virtual awards presentation. And congratulations again to our wonderful honorees. Please stay safe and well.